Welcome to my session on diversity and inclusion. I'd like to introduce myself a little bit. I actually have a master's in environmental planning and sustainability, and I was studying sustainability at a key point in the early 90s, when it was kind of still quite new. When I came to Brussels, I ended up working in a not-for-profit promoting issues of diversity and inclusion. And now I'm an executive coach. So I'm really happy to be sharing my thoughts on how diversity and inclusion completely belongs in the Conference on Sustainability, and also how it can really help you to be more responsible socially, take on a social responsibility. Which leads me to my first slide. Hopefully you will be familiar with the 3 E's of sustainability, given that most of you have been in a conference all week. Often when we talk about sustainability, we tend to focus on the overlap between the economy and the environment. But the 3rd E, equity, also sometimes referred to as the social sphere, is really of equal importance for sustainability. Because what's the point, the way I see it, what's the point of protecting the world if we're not really going to protect it for everyone and make sure that everyone has got an equal chance and equal opportunities? So this 3rd E, the equity E, is for me, it's a really key component of what sustainability is all about. I'd like to show you, it's not just about like being good people and saving the planet and creating an equitable world, but the research shows us that when we have a diverse and inclusive workforce, we have the potential to create a lot more effectiveness and a lot more productivity. So I want to introduce a framework. It's an inclusion framework, and let's see how it relates to the thing about being effective or ineffective. So from the research, they've come up with 2 dimensions that support a feeling of being included. So the first dimension is around whether or not you feel that you belong. And the second dimension is whether or not you feel that your uniqueness is valued. So let's start here with the exclusion. You feel that there's kind of a group and you're kind of in an out group. You're not really in the in group. And also you feel that who you are isn't particularly valued. So an example that I have of that is there've been occasions when I, hang out with male members, for instance, of my family, yeah? And both of my brothers are really into football, and they can be talking about God knows what about football. I feel excluded from those conversations because it's not something that I have a huge interest in. So what I bring isn't really valued, and I have a low sense of belonging in that particular context. And I've also had that experience in an office when people are talking about a sport that I'm not particularly interested in. So that's one example. And I don't know if you can also relate, if you've ever been in situations where you feel excluded from a particular context. So I want to move to the assimilation one. So you have a sense that you belong, but you kind of belong conditionally. And so in the media, there's a lot of talk about code switching, especially with regards to African Americans trying to function in mainstream American society, where they have got one kind of code where they function in their own local cultures. But when they go to the office, which is more of like a mainstream white environment, they have a different code. And all the time they're kind of like giving up who they really are and assimilating to fit into the office environment. So I don't know if any of you have experienced that or had to do that because you're functioning in an environment which isn't like your normal environment.
Yeah, I work in the logistics industry, and the guys like to hang out and have beers, and they used to make me drink beers just to be part of the crowd, and I really didn't like it.
Right, that's a great example where you're having to do something that isn't really what you want to do. So on the other side, we've got differentiation. So this is where your uniqueness is valued, but somehow you don't really belong. And in my work with women, I often hear about this very senior women who like might be on the board even of an organization, but somehow there's an old boys network that's functioning, and they're kind of not included in key conversations. And differentiation, one example of that is this kind of tokenism, where somebody is invited so that, you know, we've got somebody of a particular ethnic origin on a panel or on a board or in a group because we want to show that really we're doing all the right things. But actually, when you turn up, it's really clear that what you bring isn't especially valued. So that's the unique, the differentiation. And then, of course, when you have a high sense of belonging and that what your individual contributions are really valued, then that's where we get to inclusion. And hopefully, all of us have a sense of inclusion most of the time. But this talk is really to kind of help us think about, well, maybe there are some people that aren't as included as we'd like them to be, and what can we do to help them feel more included? I would hold that all three of these other ones, perhaps with a possible exception of what you've just mentioned, when you're inviting in an expert because they are an expert, if people are feeling excluded or people are feeling that they cannot really be themselves, you're more likely to have a team that's going to fall into very ineffective. So I think the point about this graph is that it's not like the normal distribution and that, you know, a diverse team is automatically going to be very effective. And if it's not working, it'll be, you know, less effective. It's likely to flip right over to be very ineffective if you're not communicating properly and if you're not involving people and helping them to be included. Yeah. And And as you mentioned, this favoring where we're not even aware of it. And it's well documented. And there is this, if you're interested to see how many biases you have, you can take Harvard have got this implicit bias test. And you've got all these different categories: gender, age, ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc., where they flash different images. And the idea is we tend to associate, you know, dark images with certain kinds of people, or with women. We tend to see them as more of like caregivers than, and men tend to be associated with being providers. And it's, this test can actually help you to understand your own implicit bias, because once you're aware of it, you stand a better chance of like, oh, what have I just said, and have I excluded anybody, and what implicit biases are there? I wanted to give an example. You mentioned this thing about CVs going out without any names. A classic example comes from the world of classical music, because until relatively recently, it was genuinely thought that men were somehow better able, more capable to be classical musicians. And it started, I believe, in the Boston Chamber Orchestra, where they said, okay, well, let's just see what happens if we put up a screen between the adjudicators and the people coming to audition for the orchestra. And so they couldn't see who was playing. In actual fact, it didn't make any difference. So they were kind of scratching their head and saying, oh, maybe really men really are better at playing classical music than women. And then they hit on something else, that when a man walks into a room, the sound is different than when a woman walks into a room, because women tend to wear heels, yeah? And the sound of somebody wearing heels is different than somebody who's wearing flat shoes. So it wasn't until they asked all the people auditioning to take their shoes off and they walked in, barefoot, that they started to get the change, and more women were able to join the orchestra. So that's how entrenched it is. And I also want to say that I hear it from I've heard it from quite a few women, that, we also have our own implicit biases that disfavor our own group. And I've heard it, a few times, that a female leader, she will get asked by an employee, a man, and they will view their view for promotion differently than when it's a woman that comes for asking for promotion. So it's we because our society has trained us to have certain associations with men, men being providers, and women, well, okay, you're working on the side, you're not necessarily the provider, even if you actually are. It's so deep ingrained in our unconscious that even people from the minority groups have got negative associations with, our own group, like whether it's a woman or whether it's ethnic minorities. So
and the risk we have.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. I'm not pretending that in this 1 hour we can solve all the problems of diversity and inclusion, but I'm just kind of raising some things for you to reflect on. And I'd like to move on to some tips that I have for you. So the first tips are really about self-reflection. So reflecting on yourself, on your own privileges and identity, the pluses and the minuses of it. And also to reflect on, when you're having a conversation or a dialogue, whose voice is missing. See if you can include them. To reflect also on your own assumptions about other people, how they're behaving, what their appearance is, and to reflect on the structures that you've got in place inside your organizations. Who is it serving? Is it serving equally everybody, or are there advantages or disadvantages? And also to reflect on policies regarding how you hire people and how you promote people. And is there some kind of bias or distortion being created? Also want to invite you to be careful with first impressions, so that you don't necessarily go with your first impressions, because even though they're often right, they're not always right. And as we were talking earlier about helping people to create an helping you to create an environment where everybody can kind of jump in as quickly as possible. When we're in a monocultural group, we tend to think like everybody else. So there's that tendency that when we don't have the diversity, we lose out on the diversity of perspectives that can benefit us. And if you're not sure, see if you can put yourself into somebody else's shoes. Lastly, I think the most important thing I want to share with you is that you talk about it, that you share your ideas, because it's all about raising awareness and raising knowledge so that the whole group or the whole team and the whole organization can move forwards to be more inclusive for everyone. So I'm wondering if anyone would like to, if I've missed anything, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And also, I'm just aware that we've got a few minutes left. So I'd love to hear from any reflections on this, or if not, I'm going to hand it back to Brian to complete the session.